So, this very famous sonnet by Shakespeare begins with a kind of defiant address to time. So, devouring time, it says. So, in other words, uh, Shakespeare is directly talking to time as though time was a person or someone he could address. So, this is an example of what's called personification. When something that's not a person is made to appear like one in writing, a poetic technique, which is one of the ways a poem is composed. So style is how a poem is written, at least in terms of poetry. And it basically means how it's kind of put together and how meaning is created and emotions are conveyed and so on, as opposed to what the poem is about. That's a quite crude definition, a very simplistic one. But basically, style is kind of like the surface, I guess, and then the what happens is kind of like the core. But it's also not that simple either. But style is kind of how it's all put together, and the kind of like the way it's presented. It's the way the different parts are put together overall. And then the that's the reason we have style is to underscore the content and create the content through form, and make sure that we can understand the content on an emotional level. Shakespeare could have just written this in very simple, non-imaginative prose, but he didn't. So we need style. We need poetic style to enhance the emotional effect of the poem. Be that as it may, this poem begins with an address to time. It pretends time is a person who devours, or something, a being that can be talked to. So, devouring time, blunt thou the lion's paws. So, blunt thou the lion's paws. That's basically like a wager, kind of like saying you can do this, you can do all these things, you can blunt the lion's paw. So it's an imperative. Basically, it's saying you go and blunt the lion's paws, make the earth devour her own sweet brood, pluck the keen teeth from the fierce tiger's jaws, and burn the long-lived phoenix in her blood. So Shakespeare is saying, time, you can do all these things, but if you do one most heinous crime, so skipping ahead a bit, and that is carve with your hours my love's fair brow. So carve, in other words, carve wrinkles. He's talking about wrinkles being kind of like engraved in in the the young man or the beloved's face. So carve not with thy hours, so don't let time pass and therefore winkles grow on the beloved's face. So it's a metaphor, in other words, comparing two things that seem to be unrelated. So wrinkles and time, or rather saying that time can carve. So it's I guess it's properly an image, um, but it's also comparing time, the process of time, to carving, basically. So comparing two things, and the process, specifically the process of growing wrinkles over time, over a period of years, or at least a lengthy amount of time, to carving someone's face. So it's comparing two things that seem to be unrelated and making a connection, at least on an imaginative and emotional level, between them. That's surprising but also appropriate, which is a hallmark of metaphors. Nor draw no lines there with thine antique pen, same thing. Him and thy course untainted do allow for beauty's pattern to succeeding men. So he's saying, you let him go untainted, go without any blemishes, any don't let him be spoiled. For beauty's pattern to succeeding men. So he'll be beauty's pattern, like the model of all beauty, the pattern that beauty is based on. So pattern in those days meant kind of like the model, like the example, the exemplar, the most notable example of beauty to succeeding men, so men who come after, so in other words, later generations. So everyone will talk about the beloved's beauty for generations and generations, if time will just let him be immortal, basically. But then Shakespeare ends with a kind of twist. So, yet do thy worst, old time. Despite thy wrong, my love shall in my verse ever live young. So do whatever you will, time. Do your very worst. Despite whatever you do, despite the worst you can do, so thy wrong, my love will always live in the poetry that I write. My poetry will make him immortal, will immortalize the person I love. So yeah, if you don't know, these sonnets are actually addressed to a man. So we don't know if that means that Shakespeare was gay or like or whatever. Or we don't really have sufficient information. I guess it's quite probable. Even though it's a controversial topic in some ways. So less so these days, I guess. But certainly it is the case that these are poems written to a man and love poetry. So make of that what you will. The other portion of the sonnets are addressed to a woman. So whether that means these are all autobiographical and Shakespeare was by or he was just making an imaginative narrative. We don't really have enough evidence to properly claim, but there are suggestions one way or another, I guess. So you can make up your own mind. But yeah, basically, yeah, Shakespeare is saying what time do many bad things to everything else. So make the lion's paws less sharp, blunt them, in other words, make them not powerful anymore. Make the earth devour her own sweet brood. Make the earth devour the things it produces that it grow on it. Make them die even and return to the earth from which they were born. Pluck the keen teeth from the fierce tiger's jaws and burn the long-lived phoenix in her blood. So everything dies, but don't let my beloved die, because the beauty he represents is too powerful, is too important for that to happen. But even so, it will always live in my poetry. That's really what Shakespeare is saying. So it's quite touching, I think, and it's quite a classic example of taking one idea and kind of complicating it, I guess, or contrasting it to another. So the idea of please let my love be immortal compared to, but he will be anyway, because everyone will read this poetry for generations and generations, and they'll read about the person I loved, and that'll grant my love immortality, which is kind of what happened, I guess. So just goes to show.